Greetings, everyone. My name is Jamie W. Wohn, and today I will be talking on the important topic of inequality in schools and education. Let us first begin with a brief preview of what this presentation will be covering. We will begin by listing some types of inequality and their impact on the community. Then we will briefly discuss the victims and those impacted by inequality in schools and education. We will have a brief summary of some events in the history of the topic in the United States and the issues or potential results that come from these events. We will be talking about some existing support systems. I will be sharing an institutional insider's perspective gathered in the form of an interview on their thoughts on the issues and their thoughts on the solution to one aspect of the issue. We will list some examples of opportunities often unavailable to underprivileged groups, a brief summary of what a couple theorists say on the topic, and finally, I will share my thoughts on the topic. Let us now start with the topic of inequality. There is financial inequality, which is inequality experienced based on the financial status or class. There is racial inequality, which is inequality based on racial background. There is gender inequality, which is inequality based on what your sex is. We will primarily be discussing financial and gender-based inequalities, but there is some intersection in this issue that we will be covering, as it does bleed over to other types of inequality, such as racial inequality and how that ties into some of the historical factors that I will be discussing later on. Now, let's briefly discuss who is impacted by inequality. Well, this includes students and teachers. These two may seem fairly obvious, but it also impacts society at large and also impacts and leads to multi-generational victimization and impact. Throughout this presentation, those impacts may become more apparent to you as we go. Now, looking at financial inequality as briefly discussed previously, is based on financial status or class. If you look at this slide, I will show you one way in which financial inequality is built into the school's educational system structure. In the example here, we have a diagram of local funding and how it is designed for different communities. Looking at this diagram, the structure and principle from community A and community B both look identical, but in reality, the difference can come in at the individual variables of each community, as well as the independent variables, which are very important. You may ask, what are these individual and independent variables in which I speak of? The most obvious one for the independent variable is that they must obviously be in the same country, for they have the same structure, so we can rule out that there is any variance in nationality. However, as far as the individual variables that may impact things, there is the factors of the state's resources, which can vary depending on what state the school is in. Even if the structure is the same, the resources can be different, just as the amount of money gathered for these resources can be different based on the community that the resources are being drawn from, such as state resources could be taxed. This is such as state resources, such as the tax that each state levies, and those go into education, which goes into the schools. Now then, from each state's resources to Social Security, that will go to the retired people and the workers so that will be a variable that can determine how many of the state's resources can go into the school, because retired people, depending on the number, will draw on that, but from the workers to the local fiscal revenue that puts into the local public education, that will also be varying based on what kind of income they get and what's the income of the area, potential city, and state taxes, which differ from city to city or state to state. And that can make a great bit of difference with the inequality of the schools, especially when it comes to the financial resources. A real-world example of this is that people who work and live within the city of Grayling, Michigan, get taxed for working and living in that city extra, even more than from the next town over, Frederick, or even further over, Roscommon. They charge an additional tax that also goes into the funds that help support the local education of the local community schools. City taxes and city resources also will impact the equality and inequality of education within those different districts. So, while looking at this, it looks equal on the surface in idea and structure. The realities are that it doesn't give an equal yield or equal result in every community. And like with students, you can't put them all in the same structure and teach them things or distribute information or resources the same way and expect them to get the same result every time. Looking at the example of the diagram, one of the biggest impacts on the percentage of the community is that retired workers, as retirees, they no longer have to contribute their earnings from work into the pool that goes into the fund education. So how does the financial inequality in education institutions impact the community? Looking at the example of the diagram, one of the biggest impacts is on the percentage of the community that is retired. As retirees, they no longer have to contribute their earnings from the pool work into the pool that goes to fund education. Often this can lead to schools that are in towns primarily filled up with retirees to gaining less funding to their education for their students and schools of that region. Another example would be that those in those regions might have to make do with older resources that may no longer be up to date. An example of this might be books that still include Pluto as a planet, regardless of whether you agree with that decision or not. Or there could be books with maps from when Soviet Russia was, well, still Soviet and has the USSR on it. USSR, actually, would be correct. It could include reasons and facts that have long since been disproven, or figures that are wildly inaccurate. That may lead to misunderstandings or have consequences for the grades of the students going forward. It can lead to limitations on how far students can go in the education system beyond the K-12 system, if they even get past that point. Besides the students, this would also impact the teachers. It would limit how much of a livable wage they may be able to earn and whether or not they can teach this subject without having to pay for materials out of pocket due to the insufficient funds given to the schools to get the resources necessary for the courses and programs they offer or are required to offer. Looking how this impacts the community and the future of the community, let's say multiple generations go to this school and use the same resources that are out of date or of insufficient quality. The previous generation will not be able to help or aid the current generation and correct the misunderstandings that stem from inaccurate resources, because they would have lived through and within using those inadequate resources, potentially not even knowing any different, or if the quality of the level of education is given subpar, social mobility may be stunted, and this would limit them from making a shift from one generation to the next into a better situation based on district if they are unable to move to a more expensive location, for example. Gender inequality, as discussed previously, is inequality based on the sex of a person. Gender inequality, according to UNESCO in 2014, in many regions around the world, girls are still less likely to complete primary and secondary education than boys. And this can be factored based on cultural norms, economic factors, safety concerns are often cited as barriers. But despite higher academic performance, systemic barriers that limit their advancement in higher education, especially in STEM fields, according to the Wohn and Dougal in 2013, gender inequality can intersect and be compounded by factors such as race, financial situation, as well as cultural or religious background, and this can impact both males and females. Males of discriminated groups can face similar experiences and barriers to that of women of less discriminated groups. So, how does this impact the community? This impacts the community by limiting the direction in which people of particular sex feel accepted in progressing their future careers or the future of their education within society. Examples include women being discouraged from taking courses that include woodshop or metal fabrication or STEM field classes, or other classes that are typically seen as masculine presenting. The same can be stated of men subjects, of course, in courses that are seen as feminine presenting, like home economics, psychology, and other courses of those type of natures. This type of limitation and inequality can cause a lack of progression and development within communities of personnel into key structures and limit advancement in certain fields going forward, such as the medical field, like nursing, or in engineering or carpentry. Progression of the community's skills and resources can be stagnated by the biases limiting the development of the children. This can apply to teachers too, where they are held back from or discriminated for teaching subjects that are not seen as in line with their gender roles. All right. So far, we have discussed the type of inequalities and their impact on the community. We have also discussed who are the victims and who are those impacted by this topic. Next, we will be talking about the brief history of the topic, some support systems, and maybe opportunities limited to the underprivileged. After that, it will be an insider's perspective, some theorists' perspectives, and my perspective. So, in the history of everything, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This is involving the separate but equal schooling, and this is based on racial inequality. 1954's Brown versus Board of Education was about desegregating schools, also about segregation based on and inequality based on race. And the stand at the schoolhouse door was where this politician decided that he would try to prohibit people from even getting into the offices to sign up for courses and classes at the school in Alabama. And it was referred to as the stand in the schoolhouse door. And this, yeah. And then there came the busing issues. The busing issues was when the goal of further desegregating education occurred. Courts across the United States ordered some of the school districts to begin busing students from either inner city or the suburbs to different schools to help with the desegregation effort. This brought students outside of their neighborhoods and to schools they would normally not have had opportunities to attend in attempts to bring racial diversity into balance. This practice did bring a great deal of public resistance from people on both sides, dissatisfied with people being forced to travel to schools that they were unfamiliar with and outside of range that parents could regularly visit and check in potentially. Some of the issues involved included the factor that with these busing that students could not participate in the after-school events that they used to be able to because without getting on the bus at the end, they would have no way to get back to their homes otherwise after those types of sports events or things like that, which also limited the potential social mobility and development of these people by being unable to form those connections and get those formative groups as well. But these are just some examples of how inequality has been seen in history in the U.S. And these are according to Introduction to Sociology 3E, which was published in 2021. So, support systems. So, some support systems developed that I know of are the Department of Education, which we are not certain of how long that will be around due to current political issues ongoing. Department of Education is meant to help limit and solve some of these inequalities within the system. Does it always succeed? Obviously not. But there's also, in Michigan specifically, that I know of for sure, Michigan has free public pre-kindergarten and Head Start programs. I cannot speak for the other states as I'm not experienced in the policies of each state, but I am more familiar with that of Michigan. There are independent educational plans, or IEPs, that can be implemented for students as well to help with difficulties in learning or differences in style of learning. There were options for tutoring, and there exists before or after school programs, and then there is busing as well for those who cannot drive their students to school. And yes, this is a continuation of the program that was problematic when it was first implemented in the history section of this presentation. So on this slide, I have a few examples of opportunities that are often unavailable to underprivileged groups. The first of which is paid tutoring, as that can be limited by financial inequality between students. In families, there is cost-prohibitive technology and supplies. Poor districts or poor families in districts may have no ability to afford technology or supplies that some better off communities might be able to supply, or there is also sometimes having to put up with materials that are subpar or very old and lacking in many respects due to inability for the district to afford proper materials. Some examples of cost-prohibitive technologies might be computers or internet or tablets, in which to do work on or submit things via digitally online or to do research on. Language assistance people who come from different culture or may not be native English speakers may not be able to afford or experience education in the way that others might due to lack of resources to either get translators or take classes in a language in which that they are more familiar with. Lastly on this list is the diversified individual education. This can come in many forms. It could be teachers teaching to each student learning style. It could be private tutors. It could be homeschooling. Or it could be simply getting the support to get an education with potential disabilities you may or may not have. All right, so far we have discussed types of inequality and their impact on the community, victims and those impacted, a brief history of the topic, support systems and opportunities limited to the underprivileged. Next will be an insider's perspective, then a theorist's perspective, and finally my perspective. I interviewed Carol Shields, a professional K-12 public school system educator for 20 plus years. She is now retired. She is 72 years old. And I conducted this interview on March 27th of 2025. The topic we were talking about was inequalities in schools and education system. And based on her experience, what she has observed, one of the questions I asked about was whether or not she thought inequality was getting any better or worse or was the same. She thought it was about the same. As people, kids, and students are all different and they all have different ways of learning and different paces. Furthermore, the financial situation of the district also impacts this as well. So we asked her about what kind of changes she would like to see. She would like it if there was the resources and opportunity to give every child an IEP, which is an individual education plan as discussed before, because of the different varying ways people learn. She used me as an example and said that I was, and she suspects still is, a very tactile learner. Others may learn best by hearing or self-study, or need someone to bring their focus back to the lesson or rephrase it differently for them to comprehend context. Example of those impacted by this are people with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, or any other number of factors that may impact how people learn. I asked her about potential challenges to see this change, and she said that most of those challenges involve the government and funding, like discussed before. So her solution, if she was still teaching, she thought that the best way to go about it would be to begin with avocation with the government to standardize the funds given to educational institutions, not based on the number of students on a particular day, like a count day, for example, but perhaps based on enrolled students, supplies cost, and course curriculum needs. If a poor area, perhaps extra programs for supplies for students and food, as it is hard to focus on learning when you're hungry or can't afford required materials. Theorists. Some examples of theorists to be discussed on the topic of inequality in education are Pierre Bourdieu, Jean Jean Agnon, Max Weber, Bowles and Gintis, Lisa Delpit, and Gloria Ladson-Billings. Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital explains how families transmit cultural knowledge and skills that influence educational success. He argues that educational system often favors those from privileged backgrounds. So that is discrimination based on financial background primarily. Agnon conducted research on how socioeconomic status affected educational opportunities and experiences, and hers highlighted differences in school curriculum and resources based on the community's economic status, which is still furthermore financial inequality. Max Weber's analysis of social stratification included the role of status groups and how educational credentials serve as a means of maintaining social inequality. In other words, if you don't get the proper education or a job of a certain type, you do not have as much opportunity to be socially mobile. Bowles and Gintis argue that the educational system perpetuates class inequalities through its structure and functionings, aligning with the needs of capitalist economy. So once again, financial inequality primarily. Lisa Delpit discusses the cultural disconnect between educators and students from different backgrounds, emphasizing the importance of recognizing and valuing diverse cultural experiences in education. This, I found, was very important because if you don't understand the people you're teaching or understand how to converse with the people you're teaching, it is hard to teach them effectively. And lastly is Gloria Ladson-Billings. She focused on the concept of culturally relevant, I'm going to butcher this word, but pedagogy, arguing for educational practices that acknowledge and incorporate students' cultural backgrounds to combat inequality. These theories provided various lenses in which to analyze community and inequality in education. And they talk about the intersection between social structures and educational outcomes. But like I discussed previously, a lot of this ties back to primarily financial inequality, sadly. My personal thoughts and reflection on this topic is that financial spending and tracking is essential for institutions. For example, since a lot of these funds come from the public, they should be required to keep public records of their expenditures, what it's being spent on, and that way we can make sure that all the funds are going to where they are intended to be distributed to. A potential solution based on what Carol Shields said was potentially curriculum supply based stipends. So give stipends to the schools based on the curriculum for classes that they are required to teach for curriculum. So for science classes, for example, give them the resources to be able to afford the tools and materials needed to teach the lessons or do the experiments required for the lessons within that curriculum, for example. there needs to be representation in authoritative positions for respective classes and communities. So, for example, in the school board, there should be people from each sex and each culture and race that is represented in the school by the students and teachers on the school board, so that their perspectives are being shared. A potential solution that came up in discussion in class was screening for dispositions that could be harmful for the purposes of education. For example, people who publicly share thoughts that are racist or sexist, or teach in a way that perpetuates those issues, should be screened out, was a thought. Many cultural or social changes require changes on a multi-generational scale. So, for example, a way to implement change within this issue and topic is to make sure multiple generations are on board with this idea. Start with the current or the next generation and teach them the way they want to be taught, but it requires the interaction of the previous generation and to support and develop those thoughts and processes so that the change is more holistic in scale. Today we have talked about the types of inequalities, their impact on the community, victims and those impacted, a brief history of the topic, support systems, opportunities limited to the underprivileged. I gave the insider's perspective of Carol Shields, a few theorists' perspectives, and my own personal perspective on the topic. I used a very long list of sources for this project. For example, the photo of Carol Shields was taken by Michael Shields on March 15th of 2025. The interview with Carol Shields was conducted on March 27th, 2025 by myself. And I used various CSP and sociology resources that I found and various things through the CSP website to find information, for example, on the theorists as discussed before. I want to thank you all for listening to this presentation, and I hope you learned something. Thank you.